Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Arthur Glenberg. He is emeritus professor in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University, also emeritus professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a member of INICO at the Universidad de Salamanca in Spain. He does basic research in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience with a focus on developing theories of embodied cognition in the areas of language, education, and social processes. And those are some of the topics that we're going to focus on today. So, Dr. Glenberg, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, so just to situate things historically a little bit, I think that back in the late 50s, 60s, we had in cognitive science what people call the cognitive revolution. So before we get into embodied cognition and what it is about, so what are some of the most important things that the cognitive revolution brought to cognitive science?
Right. First off, it just brought a real freedom to do cognitive science, at least in the United States throughout the first half of the 20th century. So much of work in experimental psychology, what evolved into cognitive science, was within the behaviorist tradition. And so it was difficult to explore people believed it was not scientific to explore certain processes that we now think of as central to cognition. And the cognitive revolution in the 1950s, based in part on advances in computer science and advances in linguistics, advances in philosophy, demonstrated that it would be possible to scientifically explore questions about consciousness, questions about attention, questions about memory. I see I froze again. I'll try that same. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, you're back.
Yeah. So I'll just continue trying to do that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so that was one thing. It's that it brought a freedom to investigate those ideas. It brought a new approach to psychology, to cognitive psychology, mainly an approach based on a computer-type metaphor, where the main theoretical approach was to propose that human thinking was very much like computer thinking. And people like Simon, a Nobel laureate, were very important in promoting this point of view. And then within philosophy, people like Jerry Fodor were also very prominent in promoting this point of view. And it came to be called the computational theory of mind, that people are thinking, doing computations much like a computer. So that's the background. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So how do we go from the cognitive revolution to embodiment and embodied cognition?
Yeah, I think there are a number of routes that were taken. One route was due to the perceptual psychologist James Gibson, who noted that what we do when we're perceiving the world, at least with visual perception, is that we're getting ready to act, and that how we act depends on the sort of bodies that we have. So, for example, if we, notice a snake on the path, well, we don't try to fly away because we don't have wings. I mean, that would just not be very effective. Similarly, a bird who notices the snake would try to fly away rather than perhaps backing up, which would not be effective for the bird. So how we deal with the environment, how we think with the environment, depends a lot on our bodies. So that was one way to see, that the idea of humans being computer-like and only having a central processing unit that didn't take into account its body, that didn't seem like a good idea. And then we had others. So, for example, George Lakoff in linguistics, showing us that a lot of our use of language seems to come from how we use our bodies and our understanding even of very abstract concepts can be based on metaphors, based on the way our bodies work. And then maybe a third strand in there is just psychologists in general, across psychology, appreciating that human beings are animals, and that we need to consider psychology's relation to biology and take advantage of some of the thinking in biology, and to appreciate that our cognition may be closely related to our biological sense. So, those are some of the trends that I think moved us away, or at least some of us who think that the idea of embodied cognition is a good idea, moved us away from the computer metaphor and the notion that all thinking is essentially a type of computation of the sort that a computer does.
Mm-hmm. Does embodied cognition deal with all aspects of our cognition, or is it more interested in some domains than others?
Yeah, my personal push is to try to get embodied cognition interested in all domains of cognition. And that's why I started out looking particularly at language, because that was a domain in which it seemed like we use language in a way that doesn't depend too much on our body. We can sit here, you and I, and we don't have to be moving too much. And we just talk and we seem to understand one another. Where's the body in that? And so that was a bit of a challenge to try to show how language use and language understanding really does intimately depend on the body. And so whenever I find an area where it looks like the body isn't involved, that's when I scratch my head and I say, well, wait a minute, it almost certainly is involved. How can we make progress in this domain? Now, not everybody believes that. Some people think that embodied cognition should only apply here or only apply there. But personally, I'm just completely convinced that our bodily self is relevant to virtually all of our cognition.
Mm-hmm. I understand. And how do you look at the relationship between embodied cognition and other branches of cognitive science? I mean, where do you position embodied cognition exactly in relation to those other sciences?
Yeah, I think embodied cognition is clearly part of cognitive science. I think it's still a relatively minor part of cognitive science. If you were to count up the number of people who do embodied cognition versus taking other approaches, but I think it's a growing part, and I think that in a generation or so, in 10, 20 years, that we'll see people doing embodied cognition. It probably won't be called embodied cognition anymore. It will just be that enough people will realize that that we're using our bodies all the time. Hopefully you can see that I'm gesturing a lot, while I'm talking. And, and that's one part of embodied cognition, is showing the importance of gesture for language production and language understanding. And so, people will stop calling that embodied cognition and just say, oh, I look at the role of gesture in language, for example. And so, yeah, on the other hand, it's certainly the case that we who do embodied cognition are, take huge advantage of the advances in other areas of cognition, advances in data analysis, advances in how to collect data in experiments, new experimental procedures. Certainly take huge advantage of neuroimaging. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the work in embodied cognition, is based on neurophysiological measures, EEG and fMRI and MEG and so on. And so it's not like, we're completely separated from those other branches.
Mm-hmm. What about artificial intelligence? Isn't it the case that there are some people who do work in embodied cognition that work with artificial intelligent systems?
Yeah, let me answer in a couple of ways. One, I think one component of artificial intelligence, namely robotics, is almost a perfect platform for investigating questions in embodied cognition, because a robot has a body, virtually by definition. And so we can then test some of our theories of embodied cognition. And so, yeah, we can investigate using robotics, how different sorts of bodies may lead to different types of thinking. And so, yeah, it's a great way of addressing an issue experimentally that would be almost impossible, certainly ethically impossible to do with humans. And I think part of that reasoning also shows my belief in the importance of developmental psychology for understanding human cognition, that we have to see how that cognition changes as the organism interacts more with the environment, but then also as the organism's body changes, and how that then promotes changes in cognition. There's really some amazing work in developmental psychology along those lines about how, for example, one of my favorites is work by Joseph Campos, showing about how learning to crawl then changes many, many aspects of the child's cognition. Importantly, in Campos's work, it changes.
You froze again. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm very sorry for my link or my computer. I don't know which it is. So yeah, Campos shows that children's, toddlers' fear of heights is actually related to how much experience they've had crawling. And it's not a simple relation that you might think, oh, they've been crawling, so they've fallen down and they've learned about heights and they've learned to avoid cliffs. No, the answer seems to be much more fascinating and very different. And what Campos shows is that by virtue of crawling, the toddler has to keep his eyes focused on a target that he's going for. And that then by, excuse me, by keeping that target as the focus of attention, then the infant generates a correlation between its feedback from its motor system and the optic flow, that is, the apparent way the environment passes by our head. And it's that correlation with optic flow that then defines for us what a stable world is. That is, a stable world isn't one where things don't change, where they don't appear to change. No, a stable world is one where our movement through it causes correlated changes in our sensation. And it's those correlated changes that then allow us to balance, that allow us to note when there's a cliff or a danger in front of us. And so the ability to crawl then changes our whole way of looking at what the world is. And so, yeah, there's just amazing work like that in developmental psychology that show the importance of our bodily selves, our particular bodily selves, for very abstract cognition. In this case, how we understand stability in the world. Mm-hmm. And so back to your question about AI, yeah, I think robotics is very important. And then there's other components of AI that pose a challenge, because they set up an alternative hypothesis about cognition, namely that cognition doesn't require a body. So if you're doing AI that's not robotics, you might be saying, well, look, here's a way of having some sort of intelligence that is divorced from the body. And so then that makes we who do embodied cognition, try to think harder about, what is intelligence, and what is that sort of intelligence? How does it differ from human intelligence, if it does?
Mm-hmm. Do you also study animal models apart from humans, and do you extrapolate from them to humans, at least in some ways?
So I don't personally, but certainly some of my colleagues do that, both colleagues at Arizona and at Wisconsin. But then also I've done some work with people at the University of Parma, mainly working in Rizzolati's lab on mirror neurons. And that work, much of it is done with animals. And so then, yeah, we extrapolate from the animal work to the human work. Perhaps that extrapolation, it's too much. It's very easy, to make the jump. But given recent work, in the last decade or so, on the human mirror neuron system, it seems like that extrapolation is at least in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Do embodied cognition researchers have any take in the nature-nurture debate? I mean, does embodied cognition tell us something about the innateness or the developmental aspect of certain domains of our cognition?
Yeah, I think the notion that cognition is always an interaction between nature and nurture. So the notion that cognition arises from an interaction of nature and nurture is consonant with a lot of thinking in embodied cognition. I'm trying to think whether that ought to be taken as a principle, and I don't know if people have suggested that as a key principle of embodied cognition, but it at least speaking offhand, it seems like it ought to be. And we see that in part from what I was just talking about, like with Campos's research. Yeah, it's completely, we have almost certainly a developmental type program that encourages us towards crawling, but then it's the crawling itself and the experiences that crawling generates that then changes our cognition. And I think we see that in other areas of development also. So that, not taking a stance on nature nurture, but saying, yes, both of them are critically important, fits well with the embodiment enterprise.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into some more specific questions. How do we go from the way our body is structured to concepts in our minds? I mean, what is the connection between one and the other?
Yeah, yeah. And so part of that question is what's a mind? And really, that's a very difficult question. You would think we would have a clear answer to that. We don't. We don't have a clear answer to that. I've been trying to, when I use the word mind in like a paper, I tried to define it as something different from what I think, non-psychologists would come up with. But yeah, I think our mind is really the continuous interaction between our brain, our body, and the environment, and the processes that go into that continuous interaction. But let's get back to your question. Maybe it's time for me to get a new computer. I don't know.
I'm not sure why this is happening. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. If you want, at some point, I have a laptop at home, and I can try plugging in my laptop and using that instead. So just let me know if you get irritated with me always freezing like that.
no, let's move on. There's no problem.
Yeah. So how do we go from our body to concepts? And again, let me just point to Campos as one example of that. Let me give another example, also based on developmental literature. And that example is in regard to how do we recognize goals, that one person has a particular goal. And there's amazing work in developmental psychology showing that as children get control of their bodies so that they can do things like grabbing a glass or grabbing a toy, that it's after they get the ability to grab and manipulate, that's when they then start to appreciate that another person might have the goal of drinking out of the glass, because now they can interpret the other person's action as related to their own action and their own goals. That, okay, when I do that, it means that I want to drink some water. And so now when I see you do that, I can, infer that you have the goal of grasping the glass to quench your thirst. And so we now have the development of the bodily capability that allows us to interpret, to see goals in others. And of course, that's then very closely related to the notion of a mirror neuron system. And so, what Rizzolatti and his colleagues discovered back in the middle 1990s, and this discovery was first made with monkeys, with macaque monkeys, is that there are neurons in the brain that respond similarly when the animal takes an action, such as grabbing for the glass, but the same neuron responds in very similar ways when the animal sees you grab for a glass. And so, Rizzolatti recognized that this is potentially the way in which animals, macaques and humans and other animals, are able to understand goals of others through their own motor system. And so again, we then see how our bodily selves lead to a much more abstract understanding, namely what a goal is and how other people can have goals, and perhaps things like theory of mind, that I know you're likely to have a mind because I see you doing things that I can understand in terms of my own mind, that is, my own interactions with the world. So, yeah, I think that there are a number of significant examples of that, of how we can go from our bodily selves to more abstract concepts. A challenge is always, or a challenge that's often raised for people who do embodied cognition, is the challenge is something like, well, how could we understand democracy, through our bodies? And how can we understand complex mathematics through our bodies? And at first, those questions seem, really difficult. You say, wow, what does democracy have to do with our bodies? But then as you think about it a little bit more closely, one appreciates that there are many individual behaviors that end up leading to democracy. Behaviors like going to the polling place and casting a vote, counting the ballots. And so it might be that democracy is not a simple concept that you can, get a static image for, but a process. And that process has components that are very strongly related to the individual body.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. What about emotions? I mean, how do you deal with emotions from an embodied cognition perspective?
Yeah, so let me first say that we're pushing the limits of my expertise here. Um, but I think many emotion theorists um, would would agree that a lot of our emotional experience is literally based on our bodily feelings, the feelings in our stomach, the feeling of our heart racing, the feeling of, of sweating, of feeling uncomfortable. And similarly, with positive emotions, a lot of it is within our body. Then, as I think many emotion theorists would agree, is that those emotions have functional properties. They guide our behavior in certain ways. And so, if I'm feeling an arousal that I then interpret as as love for another person, well, then, I'm going to go towards them in a friendly and a loving way. And so there's clearly a cognitive component to these emotions. But the basis of the emotion does seem to have a real bodily experience to it. So it's based on the notion of interoception, feeling, perceiving our own bodily states. And that those bodily states have a role not just in producing the feeling, but in producing action, getting you to survive, allowing you, flight or fight or, loving attraction. And so again, it's the emotions are there, not just for fun, but for survival through our action.
Mm-hmm. And what about imagination? I mean, what are some of the functions, important functions that imagination might play a role in?
Right. First, let me back up some and talk about what I think is the embodied explanation of imagination. Mm-hmm. And that explanation is really based on the notion of simulation. And that term is one that is used both in the mirror neuron literature and also an important part of Larry Jacoby's notion of perceptual symbol systems. And so, I say Larry Jacoby, I meant to say Larry Barcelou. Larry Jacoby is also an important cognitive psychologist, but not so much within embodied cognition. So Larry Barcelou's theory of perceptual symbols. And so what Barcelou means by that is that when we are perceiving situations, so when we're perceiving situations, one of his famous examples is just of a car. We have visual information, we have auditory information, we have motoric information of driving the car, and that those components to which we attend are then producing activity in various neural systems, in the system, in the motor system for driving the car, in the auditory system for hearing the car, in the visual system. And by virtue of that activity during perception, we are literally changing those neural systems. We are adjusting them so that they can now represent in a way the sight of the car, the sound of the car, so on. And those adjustments to the different connection strengths between the neurons are our memory for those instances. And then imagination or simulation is reactivating those systems. So reactivating the image of the car, reactivating how I drive the car. Actually, you don't see it, but actually, as I was doing that, I could feel my foot on the gas pedal. And so that was...
Yeah, me too, me too.
And so, right, that's part of the notion of simulation that then can be consciously perceived as imagination. So I think simulation is the basic process, and sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's not conscious. When it is conscious, that's when we call it imagination. And so, yeah, what are the functions of that sort of imagination? Well, I think one really important function is in the way we perceive the world, so that now that we've shaped our brains in particular ways, it allows us to more effectively perceive the world. at least if the world is accommodating and giving us something that fits into what we've learned. And so it makes our perception quicker and probably more accurate. But then there are other uses for that imagination. One is what people call mental time travel, and it's to our ability to think about the future, to think about what we're going to do, prosaically, just what we're going to do this day, what I need to do next, how I'm going to go to the grocery store. But it's also then more grandly thinking about the future of our lives, thinking about the future of the planet, thinking about how we engage in sustainable practices so that there'll be a world for our children and our grandchildren. And so I think that sort of thinking is imagination, it's simulation. Another role for simulation is in language comprehension. And so what we are doing now, as I'm talking to you, you are not just hearing my words, as an auditory phenomenon, but you're taking those words to drive your imagination, to drive your simulation. And when you understand me, what that means is that you're able to construct a neural simulation where the parts fit together, where you can make the information about the car and the driver and the road fit together. When you don't understand me, it's because I'm suggesting relations that just don't work for you, where you've never had those experiences. And I think it's true about driving a car, but it's also true in more abstract domains. And so if I'm talking about democracy and you've never gone to a voting booth, you've never participated in a democracy, you may not be able to understand me. If I'm talking about mathematics and I jump into a domain of mathematics that you haven't experienced, so that you aren't able to create these simulations, you don't understand me at all. And so imagination or simulation is absolutely central to human communication.
Mm-hmm. And this simulation that you are talking about, it's not only about, for example, imagining images in our minds, it also deals with emotion, right?
I think exactly. In fact, I'm in the point trying to develop that argument more formally, but I haven't gotten very far, where I want to try to show that emotion is very, very central to language comprehension. I'm going to give a couple of examples of that in a moment. But the simulation process is not just a visual simulation, but involves the auditory, involves the motor system, involves the interoception. If I'm telling you about something disgusting and you feel disgusted, so that's part of your understanding. Excuse me. Right, and certainly including a lot of information from the emotional system in these simulations. Sort of another component just wanted to address is that we shouldn't think of these simulations as static. I think most often they're very dynamic, and that dynamism is in part because of one person following the language of the other person, so the language is always driving the simulation forward, but also the dynamism comes from bringing their own experiences in, and then taking the simulation in a new direction. And probably that's what leads to a fruitful conversation. That it's not just me talking and then you mimicking what I'm saying, but you're using your experiences to drive the conversation in new directions.
Mm-hmm. In terms of language comprehension, aren't there some other components that we have to take into account? Like, for example, we've talked about simulation, emotional simulation, more specifically. What about the aspects like action and perception? What are the roles that they play there, and what is the relationship between them?
So let me make sure I understand the question. So what's the role of action and perception in language comprehension in particular? Yeah. I think the role is absolutely essential. And it's because it's our perceptual system and our action system that has given us the experiences that allow us to create these simulations that are the understanding of language. And so here's an example of a sort of sentence that I often use in trying to explicate this idea. So I say, Art was in awe of the red cliffs in the Grand Canyon while he was hiking the trail. And the embodiment perspective is that when I'm talking about Art's awe, you're feeling awe. You're using your emotional system to simulate that awe. When I'm talking about red cliffs of the Grand Canyon, you are using your visual system to imagine, to simulate those red cliffs. And when I'm talking about hiking in the Grand Canyon, you're using your motor system as if, to simulate hiking, to simulate walking. And the claim is that those simulations are what it means to understand. It's not sort of an extra process. It's not something you do because it's fun. It's the critical part of understanding. And so indeed, our action system, our perceptual system is playing this very active role in our language comprehension. Again, sometimes we feel it, or we sense a visual image, but even when we don't explicitly have a sensation, have an image, we can use neurophysiological techniques to show that that is happening. Perhaps one of the earliest and also just most brilliant demonstrations of that was an experiment, and I think it was in 2004, that was published by Hauk, Johnsrud, and Pulvermuller. They were using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to trace activity in the brain while people were simply listening to action verbs. And when they heard a word like pick, there was activity in the motor cortex of the brain, but not just the motor cortex in general. On hearing the word pick, there was activity in that part of the brain that controls the hand. And when they heard the word lick, there's activity in the brain that controls the mouth. And when they heard the word kick, there's activity in the brain that controls the legs. And so it's just this brilliant data that is very, very consistent with this notion of simulation.
Mhm. So you've already referred mirror neurons a couple of times during our conversation, but I mean, what are the kinds of behaviors or mental processes that they are behind, really? Because I think that back in the 90s, when people started talking about mirror neurons, there was a lot of hype that, I mean, people said that maybe it would explain lots of aspects of how we interact with other people and other animals as well. But I mean, what do mirror neurons really explain in terms of our behavior?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Um, I think there was a lot of hype. Personally, I think the hype was justified, and that mirror neuron, the theory of mirror neurons is still important and still helping us understand human interaction. Let me try to clearly state, however, that mirror neurons aren't doing all the work themselves. Mirror neurons are part of perception action systems, and
Okay.
that by themselves, yeah, I don't know if they could do anything by themselves. I don't know if any neuron can do anything by itself. What our understanding is that neurons simply transmit electrical activation, from one to another, and that it's through the systems acting together that we get behavior, that we, get understanding. Nonetheless, it seems that mirror neurons play an important role in this, and let me try to talk about several of those ways.
Okay.
So the original finding was mirror neurons in macaque premotor cortex that were related to explicit action, like again the grabbing of the cup. Um, and so for a while, people thought, oh, well, they're about action, maybe action recognition. That was always the Parma stance, but others thought, well, maybe it's about action selection. Um, and it's still a debate in that regard. But since then, mirror type neurons, have been found in many parts of the brain. Um, in humans, they've been found in humans. They've been located in the insula, the part of the brain that deals with interoception and emotion. So, for example, the same parts of the brain that are active when you are feeling disgust are also, the same parts are active when you see me acting like I'm disgusted with something. And so it seems to be a way of emotional recognition, in addition to action recognition. Some brilliant work with rats showing similarly um, um, that the same neuron that is active when the rat is experiencing the same neurons that are active when the rat is experiencing fear are also active when the rat sees another rat acting fearfully. Um, and so, yeah, it seems to be perhaps a relatively common mechanism in the brain for putting together um, sensation from the external environment and more sensation from the internal environment, our own proprioception from our action system, our own interoception from our other areas of the body. And so, yeah, it's, again, when it was first discovered, it seemed like it was sort of magical, that this would happen. But now, as the research has progressed over, 20 years, it seems to be almost commonplace in the brain. But that commonplace mechanism, seems to be really important for interpreting other people, conspecifics, for sort of, greasing the wheels of social interaction. Is that my mirror neuron systems help me to understand your behavior better, your mirror neurons help you to understand my behavior better, and then we can, more closely interact.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Okay, so at the beginning I've asked you about the relationship between embodied cognition and other branches of cognitive science, and in the cognitive and social sciences, people from different areas try to explain behavior using different approaches and at different levels of analysis, like, for example, the cognitive, the social, the cultural levels. So do you think that embodied cognition could unify, in a sense, these different levels of explanation?
Yeah, that's a fond hope of mine. I proposed that in a paper in the 2010 or so, that embodiment could be a unifying approach to psychology, and the reasoning really is that whenever we engage in individual cognition, when we engage in social cognition, when we engage in cultural practices, our body is always there. Our body is always, playing a role in that. And so I think it at least gives a common framework that can be used in all of those instances. How well will that work out? I can't say for sure. I can tell you that I'm working with some people at University of Arizona now on trying to document the contributions of embodiment to cultural practices, to both the development of cultural practices and how cultural practices then are, transmitted. And so, we'll see if that paper plays a role. But let me also reach over to get a book that I've been reading. I don't know if you can know if it's, yeah. So it's called A Multidisciplinary Approach to Embodiment. It's edited by Nancy Dess. And let me just read you some of the chapter titles here.
Sure.
So this is in part one. The Matter of Life and Death, how humans embody the universe. Right? At Home in Deep Time, Chapter 3, The Secrets of Life, the Vital Roles of RNA Networks and Viruses. Chapter 4, A Brief History of Death. This is Part 2, called Engaging. Attentive Bodies, Epigenetic Processes and Concepts of Human Being. Uncovering the Living Body, Bodies and Agents in Cognitive Science. I'm skipping things now. Part 3 on Coordinating. Embodied Time, a Shared Ancient Heritage. Going on to Part 5, Health and Medicine. The Power of Touch. Oxytocin and the love hormone is released by massage therapy. Chapter 19, Traumatic Embodiment, Traumatic Exposure and Healing. And so we have in this really very thin book, because these chapters are intended to be just introductions. Yeah, a demonstration of, excuse me, just got reminded that Thanksgiving is tomorrow. Um, so, yeah, just showing how people are trying to take concepts of embodiment, or at least taking the human body as central to our cognitive, social, and cultural experiences. So it's not just me, and so I'm happy about that. That other people see this as a potential unifying theoretical structure.
Great. Okay, so one last question. Can we apply this knowledge to understanding how people learn to read, how they learn mathematics, science? And I mean, by applying this knowledge, could we perhaps reframe the way we approach education?
Yeah, I think that's a marvelous question. And it's a good thing you saved it for the end, because if we had started with that, then I would have simply taken the whole time talking about that. Um, so indeed, some of my work has been trying to take these concepts and apply them in education. In particular, what I've been doing with colleagues at Arizona State and also University of Pittsburgh is trying to develop reading comprehension interventions based on principles of embodiment. And the basic idea is to try to show children that when they're reading, that the point of reading is not just saying the words out loud, that the point of reading is driving their imagination, creating these simulations. And so the way we do it is by having children reading text on an iPad, and then the text is accompanied by pictures, but the pictures are movable, so that the child explicitly creates a simulation while reading. The child creates an external simulation while reading. For example, they're reading a story about a farmer's activities on the farm, and maybe a sentence says, "The farmer drives the tractor to the barn." And the child moves the picture of the farmer over to the tractor, and then moves the tractor to the barn. And so we're, in this child-friendly way, teaching them how to go from words to simulation. And we're teaching them that a word like tractor is not just something you say, but that it needs to be mapped onto, in this case, a visual image. Perhaps more importantly, we're teaching the child about how syntax works. So much of our syntax is about who does what to whom. And so when the child, has the farmer drive the tractor to the barn, the child is literally embodying the syntax in her own action of getting the farmer to drive the tractor to the barn, the who does what to whom. And so, yeah, so far we've been finding that it's pretty effective in teaching children how to comprehend better. So that's one example. There's also work in mathematics. So a former colleague of mine at University of Wisconsin, several colleagues, Martha Ali Bali in psychology, and Mitchell Nathan in the School of Education, have been applying principles of embodiment to teaching mathematics, and again, showing, very nice effects, that is, improvements in how children understand mathematics. My wife, Mina Johnson Glenberg, has been using ideas of embodiment to try to teach principles of physics. So, for example, some of her work has been trying to create ways in which to teach principles of centripetal force. And, one of the things that she's done is to literally have children or young adults actually swing things, around their head and to feel how much force is on the arm as a function of the weight of the object, as a function of the speed, and as a function of the length of the rope that's attached. And it seems to be pretty helpful because there are some of factors that are inversely related. So, for example, the length of that rope is inversely related to the force required to keep the object spinning, so that the longer the rope, the less force that's required. And it's not something that's obvious when I just say it to you, but when you're doing this and you can feel it, then it makes it much more understandable. And one of my favorite examples of using embodiment in education is also in physics. And this was reported in an experiment where the first author's name was Contra, teaching young adults, college students, concepts of angular momentum. And so angular momentum is, one of the things that helps us to balance on a bicycle, and keeping the wheel of the bicycle upright as it's going faster and faster. And the faster the wheel is spinning, the greater the tendency for the wheel to stay upright. And the way they taught that to students is by essentially taking the wheel of the bicycle, and it's a marvelous thing. So, by the way, I hope you notice how my mirror neuron system has now become responsive to you, and I can recognize from your actions when I've frozen, and I can then get that unfrozen more quickly. So in this experiment, they have students essentially holding a bicycle wheel that's spinning, and there's something, everybody should try this at home. It's a marvelous demonstration. And you're holding it and it's spinning, and then you try to tip it, and it feels like the wheel is fighting you. That as long as you're holding it like this, fine. But then when you try to tip the wheel, it's working against you, and it is physically showing you the effects of angular momentum. But one of the most amazing things in that experiment was they then gave their participants a test on angular momentum, and the participants took the test while they were in an MRI machine, so that they were recording the functional changes in the brain. And what they showed was that the more activity in the person's motor cortex while taking the test, the better they did on the test of angular momentum. And so what the interpretation is that our understanding of what would first appear to be a very abstract idea, angular momentum, a lot of that understanding is in our motor cortex and our ability to simulate things like the wheel turning and the wheel fighting us as we're trying to turn it. So, in fact, I think that there's great opportunity for taking principles of embodiment and trying to apply them throughout the educational system. And Before ending, though, I have to just say one last thing, and that's,
Yeah.
it's like, of course, really, educators and good teachers have known this for a very, very long time, and educators are always saying, well, we need more hands-on experience. And of course, Maria Montessori and the whole idea of Montessori schools is based on these sorts of notions of embodiment, that getting children to act is one of the best ways of getting them to understand. And so it's not like these ideas are novel to we embodied psychologists, but we are, I think, providing some of the theoretical understanding as to how these ideas work.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. Okay, so let's end the interview here, but just before we go, are there any good places on the internet where people can find you?
Find me personally?
Or your work?
Excuse me. Yes, I have a website, but it's currently under maintenance. But I'll give you the address, and hopefully it will be up again soon. It's called, this is all one word, movedbyreading.com. And it's where we demonstrate some of these applications of embodiment to reading comprehension. And a lot of our papers are also available through that website. So that, at least for the work on reading comprehension, that's where people should go. For other work, they can always feel free to email me. That's a simple email address, Glenberg, Glenberg @asu.edu, and I'm always happy to send papers and respond to questions through that.
Okay, great. So I will include links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Glenberg, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
It's, well, thank you. It's been a real joy talking with you and answering your questions. And sorry that I froze so much, but at least it allowed us to develop mutual mirror neurons, in that regard. All right, thank you very much.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with top academics and scholars from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, I also have links to that in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please leave a like, share it, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Lenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windeger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, and Yannick Punter. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michal Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.